Welcome back, everyone. We are returning for our last session on tech intentional practices with Emily Cherkin. I will read her bio and then hand it over to her for her presentation. Emily is a nationally recognized consultant who takes a tech intentional approach to addressing screen time challenges. Emily spent 12 years teaching middle school in Seattle, where she watched the rise of both social media among students and technology use in schools. She has been featured for her work on screen time in the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC, NPR, The Today Show, Good Morning America, and Australia's Weekend Today, and numerous parenting websites, blogs, and podcasts. Chuck Norris even quoted her last year. Emily offers private one-on-one consulting, parent courses, professional development training, and personalized school presentations built on her tech intentional approach. As a parent of a 12 and 15-year-old, Emily understands the real-life challenges of parenting in this digital age. She is also the co-founder of the Student Data Privacy Project, which is an activist group fighting to protect student data in schools. Her book on tech intentional parenting will be available in January 2024. You can visit her website at the Screentime Consultant for more information.
Thank you, Erica. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm out in Seattle so it's my morning. And today what we're going to do is talk about screen time, which is a topic I'm sure you've all heard of. And one of my goals today is to really help you think about both the future and the present, because one of the things that happens is whenever I talk to parents of older kids, they always tell me, I wish I had known this sooner. I wish I had learned this earlier. So part of my goal today is to help you know what they wish they had known. I always like to start my presentations with this quote, that we need to replace judgment with curiosity, because there's a lot of stress around screen time and a lot of judgment for ourselves, for other families, for how people do things with their kids versus our kids. And I want to just start with this reminder because it's hard. And I actually first learned this quote probably 15 or 16 years ago when I took a mindfulness class with my husband. And this was before we had kids and I had time to take a mindfulness class with my husband. And the teachers told us this quote, and I was very struck by it because I think it was easy to feel judgmental in my own life. And so I decided to have it engraved on a keychain for my husband. And I brought it home and my cousin was over and she looked at it and she goes, Emily, you spelled judgment and curiosity wrong. And I was a literal English teacher at the time, and I was so embarrassed. But the good news was it was an opportunity for me to replace judgment with curiosity, that I could wonder why it was hard to spell these words. So for every family, screen time is going to look different. And I firmly believe that this is a fight worth having, that we are fighting for our kids' future cognitive and emotional health. And my goal today is to help sort through some of that overwhelm to help you get to the intentional. Okay, let's go on. So as Erica mentioned, I'm a parent too. And yes, these are my kids. And yes, they do get screen time. And it has been a conversation we've been having for years. My kids have the blessing and the curse of having the screen time consultant as their mother. But one of the things I noticed when I was teaching in the classroom for 12 years, starting in 2003, was the really big shift of smartphone and cell phone use and social media use. Because in the beginning of my teaching career, no kids had it. And by the time I left in 2015, probably 95% of my students had smartphones. And so things have changed really dramatically in a really short period of time. I also just want to mention that I am married to somebody who works in the tech industry. So I fully recognize the irony of that. You can imagine we have very interesting dinner table conversations, but actually he's really on board with what I'm saying. And we recognize that this impacts children really differently than adults. So let's go on. One of the things I really want to talk about today is how I see my approach to technology. I always say I am tech intentional, not anti-tech. And to me, tech intentional means using screen-based tech that enhances, nurtures, and supports us, our children, and our families in ways that align with our values, as well as resisting, delaying, and limiting screen use that interferes with healthy development. you and I'm assuming you're all over a certain age at this point, spent our childhoods with very different screen-based technology, and we're raising kids in a childhood that's going to look very different. I also want to say one really important thing here tonight, because when it comes to development and children with different diagnoses, there are some exceptions to the tech rules. And I want to accept those groups of students and children for whom a tech-based tool might be a life-saving communication device, for example, or I have a family member with diabetes for whom being able to regulate that on his phone is a really medical tool. So I am not speaking broadly to that group tonight, although I'll reference it. But I just want to make clear that there are times when a tech is really a game changer, and that's generally going to be the exception, not the rule. So one thing I really want to start with too is for you to take this away. If there's nothing else that you remember from this presentation, it's this rule of my TLDR, I call it, which is that later is better, less is more, and relationship is first. And this is true whether your child is 3 months old, 3 years old, or 13 years old. This is the approach to technology, in my opinion, that will work and be most effective. So for today, what we're going to do is just look at the big picture, talk about some developmental impacts, some ways of thinking about parenting in the tech age, and some solutions. And I'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. I commonly get asked these 3 questions. When should I get my kid a phone? Why do I fight so much to get my kids off screens? And what parental controls do you recommend? And by the end of this presentation, I'm going to address all of those in some form. And as I mentioned, I'm going to keep this with a lens both to the future, but also to the present. So wherever the children in your world are developmentally, all of this is going to be relevant because it is coming. Okay, so the big picture, let's look at where we are right now as a parent in 2023, or as someone who works with young children. This is a very rapidly changing phenomenon. In 2013, 90% of kids had access to mobile tech, and that was usually in the form of parent devices, right? By 2016, 77% of households had smartphones, and we also saw a shift to machine learning algorithms, which really changed how we interacted with technology. Of course, we had the pandemic. And then just a couple of years ago, 2 to 4-year-olds were spending about 2 hours a day on screen time. And today, we know that 1 in 6 children in the US are diagnosed with a developmental delay or disability. And there is a connection to the screen piece, and I want to talk about that in a minute. So the data is clear, and this is what we're finding both anecdotally and based on professional recommendations and surveys. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommendations for young children in screen time. And according again to the survey done in 2021, under 2-year-olds were getting a little bit less than an hour per day of screen time. 2 to 4-year-olds, like I said, 2.5 hours a day. 5 to 8-year-olds were getting 3 hours a day. Now, if we look at what the AAP recommends, it's actually very different than what we're actually seeing. So they recommend, of course, 0 screen time for 0 to 8 months old, except FaceTiming with relatives. That doesn't count. And I agree with that because no one's doing that 24 hours a day, right? We're just calling grandma here and there. And that's a great way to maintain a relationship using the screen. And then they say after 18 months, the idea is that if you're going to use screens with children, you want to co-view. And then for 2 to 5-year-olds, we want to keep that to less than an hour a day on weekdays and 3 hours a day on weekends. What's really interesting to me in this is that over 6 years old, they don't ever give time limits, which is, a question I get asked all the time is, well, how much time? And really what they just emphasize is limiting and balancing it. And I think there's something good about that in the sense that I think there's a lot of parent blaming and shaming that goes on. If your kid is in a range that's higher than these numbers, you feel like, well, then what's the point? But I do appreciate that there are some guidelines, and we are increasingly learning that there are impacts on development for children, especially really young children using screens excessively. So there is a really recent report that I'm going to be highlighting again that from the Institute of Family Studies that Gallup also was citing, that 4.5-year-olds who are not allowed to use tablets in their early years, so that birth to 2 range, had lower levels of problematic media use later. And so the important takeaway from this is really that minimizing access early when children are very young, that birth to 3 window, does positively impact how older children, 4 and 5-year-olds, interact with screens later. And sometimes that's hard to see because we don't necessarily think about that 4 years down the road. But that's a really important thing for us to know, especially when we're working with young children. I also really like to talk about the research of Dr. Doug Gentile, who looked at how children spend time in childhood. And he actually looked at it generationally, like over the different time periods, starting in the 1950s. And what you can see from this visual is that we have 168 hours in a week. That hasn't changed ever, right? But in 1950, children had 68 hours, as you can see, for all of the activities like play, reading, exploring, spending times with friends, times with family, chores, homework. And you can see that this slope changes pretty dramatically over time. And of course, that came with the introduction of television into the home, and then of course, computer and video games. And you'll notice that this ends at about 2010. Well, the last 13, 14 years, of course, has been heavily inundated with social media, smartphones, the internet. So leaving us with about 14 hours a week that children are spending doing those things that back in the 1950s and 60s, they had, close to 70 hours a week. And the important thing to take away from this is that what Dr. Gentile found was that when parents are paying attention and setting some limits and mentoring kids around screen use, that it does have a positive effect over time. And it wasn't over 2 or 3 weeks, it was over 6 or 7 months. And that's a really important takeaway, because I think parents can get very frustrated and overwhelmed by like, this isn't working, this doesn't matter, but it does. And I would say that even from day one with these tiny babies and newly walking and talking toddlers, the more that we can limit and delay access is a long-term benefit to healthy brain development. Okay. Great question. I just saw that. Is TV included in screen time? So it's a really important question, because not all screen time is created the same, right? And not all screen time impacts us the same way. So when I say screen time, I'm really talking about any screen-based technology, but I recognize that TV looks different from FaceTiming, looks different from texting. And what's really different about TV is that TV today is not what TV was like in the past. And TV in the past, we had certain shows that we could watch at certain times. And now that's not what happens. We can pretty much watch anything we want at any time. So yes, I do include it in this, but also the definition of TV has changed pretty much from when we were kids. So Dr. Doug Gentile says that children spend more time with electronic media than they do in any other activity aside from sleep. And I just want to pay one note to things about, we hear the phrase educational technology, right? Or this game is educational. Children are going to learn something from it. Children learn from what they observe. And that may be whether they're learning the letters of the alphabet or how a character treats another character. Children don't differentiate between something that's educational and non-educational. And we need to be really careful with those things that say, oh, your kid will learn this, or this is an educational app or a game, because just because it says that doesn't mean it's actually educational. Passive screen time is still passive screen time. So I want to highlight the findings of a recent JAMA pediatrics study, because what they found was that as screen time increases, so does the chance of a child being diagnosed with a developmental disability. And those, they included things like communication skills, personal skills, social skills, motor skills, and that even 2 hours a day at age 1 could be problematic. In other words, you were more likely to have a communication delay by age 2 than children who had less than an hour a day. And of course, we looked at what the AAP said, but we can also look at the World Health Organization, and they recommend no screen time for birth to 2 and 1 hour a day for 2-year-olds. So they're even a little more conservative than the AAP. Okay, let's move on. Well, the important takeaway from all of this is that kids' brains are not adult brains. That at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do know that a kid's brain isn't fully developed, and we need to think about them very differently than we think about adult brains. And if I were in the room with you right now, I would say, well, how many of you have ever had trouble, doom scrolling at night on your phone? Or how many of you said, I'm just going to watch one more episode and it's 10 more episodes, right? We're susceptible to the lure of screen time and the design features of it. And if it's hard for us to manage all of this as adults, we need to remember that it's even harder for children and even more difficult for very young children. And so very young brains are not going to respond the same way as mature adults would. And again, even mature adults don't always respond maturely. So as parents and people who work with children, we need to remember that when we're in conflict with our kids, especially around screen time, we are bumping up against a completely different nervous system and brain. Oh, yes. I believe I already said this. All screen time is educational. The issue is what exactly the content is going to be teaching a child. And this is from a pediatrician here actually in Seattle, who talks about just this, be really careful when we hear this educational thing, right? That it's a little bit like greenwashing. When something says it's environmentally friendly or it has like green labeling, it makes us feel less guilty about it. But we really just need to remember that what kids see is what they learn. And that's true of them watching us too. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about development and mental health and screen time, because it's all relevant. So I spoke to a pediatric OT recently, and she told me that today, the children she works with, it's not on handwriting, it's not fine motor stuff anymore. It's literally teaching children how to turn pages of a book, because they are spending so much time in their early years tapping on screens, touching screens. And if you've worked or seen young children in action, many of them will see a book or a magazine and try to swipe or try to expand, right? Now, that's alarming, because she has seen this change in just the last few years. And we know that that's going to have a long-term impact on children and development in education, from kindergarten and on, if this is happening when they're so young. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the skills that really matter for children and healthy development. And executive function is kind of the big one. And I talk to parents about this all the time. Executive function is something we all have. It's not limited, obviously, just to children, but we're growing it all of our lifetime. And it's the part of our brain in the prefrontal cortex where we build and learn skills like how to plan, how to organize, how to manage our time, how to regulate our emotions. And these are skills that are built over time. They're not just something that we just instinctively know, because remember, again, children are not small adults. So children and adults with ADHD diagnoses often struggle with aspects of executive function. But it's important to note that some of us are just sort of, better at certain areas than others. And kids need support and opportunities to practice executive function skills with real life people. And those skills are not going to come from spending more time on a screen. And we need to have more of these skills developed before we give them more access to screens. So it's our job as adults to help find opportunities for even very small children to have these. And it might be something as simple as, the reason why playing on Minecraft is very different than playing with blocks in the real world is that three-dimensionality, right? The cause and effect of what happens if I pick up a heavy block or a light block, and planning what's going to happen if I need to do this activity. What do I need to do? What are the steps that I need to take in order to get there? And this is also, by the way, the last part of our brain to fully develop. We don't hit that full development until we're well into our 20s or 30s, which is really fascinating, because that means all of these high school and college kids who are, young adults who are doing not the smartest things and making not the smartest choices, it's simply because their frontal lobe hasn't been fully developed yet, and they're still growing and learning. There is another thing that we need to talk about, though, when it comes to children and brain development in the era of screen time, and that is this idea of persuasive design. This is something that affects all of us, but in particular children, because again, remember, they don't have that fully formed brain. So persuasive design is essentially the use of psychology plus technology to change our behavior. And one of the examples I like to give is, there's a weight loss app called Noom. And what it does is it motivates you to get healthy or lose weight by tracking and recording. And it even says something in their marketing messages like harnessing the power of technology to help you become more fit or healthy in your lifetime. So it's really important that we understand what persuasive design is, because it's not the same thing for our children as it was for us when we were watching TV or cartoons as kids. And the reality is that for all of us, persuasive design is everywhere. And the examples include things like our bottomless social media feed, the fact that we can just scroll and scroll and scroll and never hit an end, the fact that there's autoplay features on our Netflix, right? That it's used to be that you have to click play next episode, and now it autoplays. Any type of gamification where you get points or tokens or rewards or likes or emojis for engaging or participating in something, emotionally manipulating us. And especially for children, this is going to look like things like, oh, you haven't been in this game in a long time. Your friends miss you, come back. And appealing to children's social instincts to include and be kind. I always use the example too of Duolingo, which I realize is probably for older children, but it'll say like all of their marketing is Duo misses you, or Duo feels sad that you haven't been here in a long time. That's a form of persuasive design to appeal to our instinct to want to be a part of something. We see this with well-known characters being used to attract and lure young viewers into viewing for longer, or in-app purchases as a way to level up that makes kids want to keep playing. We call that pay to play. Or making kids feel bad when they don't play, or asking kids to ask parents for more time or to buy this up-leveled thing. And of course, what this all comes back to is dopamine, because every time we engage, every time we get a like or a compliment or a hit or an engagement, we get that burst of dopamine and it feels good, and we don't want to stop, because why would we, right? It feels good. So I just saw the chat pop up. Okay, I will come back to questions too, but I'm just keeping an eye on it. And I want to share this quote, that there are only two industries that refer to their customers as users. It's illegal drugs and software. And that's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, that it taps into our neural pathways in such a way that it is hard to put it down. It is hard to stop scrolling. It is hard to resist. And so what I always tell parents is, this is not a fair fight. This is not your child being stubborn. This is your child being hooked by the design features of the technology. So it is not you versus your child. It is you versus a dopamine feedback loop, a hijacked neural pathway, not you versus your child. And because these apps and platforms and devices are designed to keep us hooked and wanting more, we really can't expect a child to just hand it over when the time is up, or to not have a meltdown when the time is up, or to be mad when we say no and they want it. And again, because children's brains are not like adult brains, this is very, very different and very, very challenging. Okay. So I'm going to take you into the future for a minute, because as I said, it might be kind of hard right now to imagine your young child as a teenager, but that's where we're headed. And as I keep mentioning, these parents tell me, I wish I had known this earlier. So take it from your future parent self and heed this warning now. A parent right now, or teens right now, we know that is a teen mental health crisis in America, and we can't expect that, even in 10 or 12 years, our kids aren't going to be that are going to be immune from it. They're going to be impacted by it either directly or indirectly. And what they found in 2021, the CDC did a youth behavior risk survey, and they found that 57% of girls report persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness by spending time on social media. And 1 in 3 teen girls has even contemplated seriously suicide. I recently did a talk at a school where a parent had written to me and said, well, my child spends a lot of time trying to find exactly the right product online to fix what she thinks is wrong with her. And I just found that heartbreaking, because this is not something that happens overnight. This is something that has built with time. And I know that parents are well-meaning, and I know that it isn't about like, no parent wants this. No parent wants their child to go through this experience. But at the same time, I feel like it happens and we go, oh my gosh, how did this happen? So the good news is there are things that we can do. And I want to tell you what they are, because I don't want anyone to leave today feeling hopeless or too overwhelmed. The good news is every single person listening has a tool in their toolbox right now that is free. It does not require an app or a phone, and you can get started today. And that is the relationship you have with your child. And I'm citing this survey, or this study is so fresh. It's not even a week old. It was just released. Gallup and the IFS, which found well, I'll tell you exactly what they found, which is that relationships are the bottom line, that's what's going to matter in all of this. And that is going to matter even with very young children. It's incredibly important to build that foundational relationship now. That's the good news. This early years are so powerful. So it's true that relationships work, but we have to ask the right questions. And the wrong questions to ask are these. What parental controls do you use? And how much screen time should my child get per day? And the reason that these are the wrong questions is because what the research found was that those things are not actually going to predict or determine success and happiness and strong mental health. What they found was that these are the right questions to ask. Number one, do you know what your child is doing online? And number two, do you have a strong relationship to your child, with your child? And this is going to be true from birth onwards. Anytime your child is engaging online, and in the beginning, it might be just FaceTiming with relatives, right? But eventually there is the moments where the kids are in the grocery cart or kids are in the stroller and we hand over the phone to tame the tantrum, to keep kids distracted. But the problem is it is a hop, skip, and a jump from one algorithm-driven video to another, and it goes bad really fast. And I'll give you an example. When my son was young, and this was 10 years ago before the algorithms got way smarter and stronger, he loved watching Lego train videos and Legos and trains and all of those things. So we would look up Lego train videos on YouTube and he would watch them. And of course, because he was 4 or 5, he was like, I want to watch the Lego trains crash. And so he would type, we wrote Lego train crash. So then there were some videos of Lego trains crashing. 1 second later, a video of real trains crashing popped up because all the algorithm did was drop the word Lego. And, here we are as parents. Of course, I don't want to sit there and show my child real trains crashing, but it was just so fast that algorithm drove that to him that it really shocked me. And it made me realize, like, we have to be aware of what our kids are doing online. That being said, in order to find that out, we have to have a strong relationship to them. We have to be able to talk to our kids about what they're seeing online. And that's got to be in a non-judgmental way. I know parents feel like, well, I can't just ask them, they'll get mad at me or they won't tell me. Well, that means we got to go to that second question and figure out what is it that's going to make that relationship stronger? What do we need to do to engage with them so that they will tell me, so that we can converse about it? And this is going to start when they're really little, when they're watching Bluey on Netflix or whatever, and it's going to be having the conversations about the show and what they're seeing. That's one way we're going to start to build it. And of course, the bottom line of this research was strong parenting relationship patterns strongly predict youth mental health. And so again, I'm inviting you to take that long view, to see that what we do right now in these early years matters so much to that mental health piece later on for children. So I want to jump a little bit into the tech intentional parenting part of this, because it does start young and it does matter what we do from those early days. But again, I'm not coming to judge or shame what you've done so far, because I know that a lot of us just don't know. We weren't taught this, and this is really an issue that's cropped up and become more exponentially difficult, I would argue, in the last 4 or 5 years. So that's the age group of this community, is this younger than 5 challenge is even more difficult right now than it was 5 years ago, in my opinion. So one of the things that I get asked all the time, of course, is which parental controls should I use? And this is not a popular response, that parental controls are actually not the solution here. I know that we want that. I know that we think, oh my gosh, well, if I can just download these things and block these apps, we'll be good and we'll keep our kids from seeing stuff. But as that research showed, and as I hear anecdotally all the time, parental controls are not the solution. And here is why. Number one, they don't work. They might work temporarily. They might work on a few things, but they are not the silver bullet we want them to be. Every parent I talk to tells me my kid found the workaround. Google exists. All kids have to do is ask the internet, how do I get around this? And boy, are kids savvy and clever. Remember how we used to program the VCR for our parents? The kids have got it figured out. And so even the most sophisticated apps and controls don't always catch everything, and our kids still find the workaround. And most of them do not monitor in-app content. And that is not because of the control company itself. It's because social media companies don't allow it. So it gives us a false sense of security. Another problem is that they cause parents a lot of stress. I have parents telling me I am up till 2 or 3 in the morning monitoring and watching my child's social media accounts. That is not a sustainable or a healthy way to be a parent. And it doesn't make our jobs easier. We are not trained IT administrators. There is a reason that technology companies don't want this to be easy for us. It's much easier for them to blame parents for this and say this is a fault of parents, rather than to make them change the business model that hooks our children in the first place. Because changing their business model would mean making things less addictive, would be putting in restrictions that actually worked. And they're not doing that because it means a different bottom line. And then finally, having parental controls doesn't stop conflict. It's not like children are like, oh, gee, thanks, mom, and for putting that time limit on my app or limiting my screen time access. They're furious. They hate it because, again, we're not fighting our kid. We're fighting that hijacked neural pathway. And so what I say to parents is I would much rather you take all that time and energy that you'd put into setting up parental controls and researching options and put it right back into connecting, modeling, and mentoring with your child, because that's the stuff that's going to protect our kids later and help them grow healthfully and optimally and make good decisions later. I call this ability to try to pick different apps. I call that digital whack-a-mole, because you think you've got one thing figured out and another thing pops right up seconds later. So that's the other, another thing just to keep in mind. Okay. I believe there are 3 mindset shifts that also need to happen when it comes to parenting around screen time, because it's hard. It's hard. Oh my gosh. And I realize there's a typo on this screen. This should say number 1. But the first mindset shift to be aware of is that as our kids grow up, their needs are going to change, their developmental stages are going to change. And I like to think of parenting not as some like linear thing where we just get better and better and improve. I mean, we do to some extent, but we also mess up a lot. Just as we think we've mastered one parenting age, they're in a whole new developmental stage and we have to relearn and approach it in a different way. And as a parent of a tween and a teen, oh my gosh, that is a very hard truth. And so I would like to have you think about parenting as a zigzag, right? That we're kind of going back and forth between like hands-on, hands-off. How much do we sort of hover and rescue and protect? And how much do we sort of let them explore the world and have freedom? And there are important times for us to be in both of those places. But it is really important for us to be thinking about our parenting as giving them opportunities to be independent, both as very young children, and to know that we're there as a support. And it's just this constant kind of dance back and forth, which is why I call it accepting that zigzag of parenting. So the second mindset that I always like to talk about, and if I were in the room with you, I would ask you, which one of these 2 things is scary and which one of these is dangerous? And most people, at a quick glance we're going to say sharks. Sharks are so scary. But the reality is that when it comes to our risk of death from these 2 things, our risk of dying in a bathtub is actually 1 in 10,000. But our risk of dying in a shark attack is 1 in over 4 million. Statistically speaking, a bathtub is far more dangerous than a shark. But the problem is we tend to overestimate the risk of things that seem scary and underestimate the risk of things that are actually dangerous, in part because of our own consumption as adults of 24/7 news media and clickbait headlines. Nobody talks about bathtub deaths in the news. We hear about shark attacks. In fact, there's even Shark Week, not Bathtub Week, or movies called Jaws, not Bathtub. And so I say this because I want to challenge us to think about how we can focus on the things that are actually dangerous for children in terms of development and mental health, and not just scary. And this is a really hard thing for parents, because our instinct, again, is to respond to the fear and the anxiety that is out there in the world. It feels like the world is a really scary place, and in some ways it is, but it's not that it's always a dangerous place. And what we need to remember is that children need opportunities to build resilience and courage and have opportunities to make mistakes and learn from them. And when we overprotect them too much, we actually take away the opportunity for them to learn some of these really, really important life skills that have a direct impact on their mental health later. And so I'm going to bring this back to screen time. I hear this all the time that, oh, I give my kids a smartwatch or a phone so that they can walk home alone. This is a very, very new phenomenon. For the most part, throughout the last 100 years, children have been walking home from school alone just fine. And I know that right now, everybody's thinking, yes, but kidnapping. And in fact, it's true. Pew Research recently found that kidnapping is the #3 parental fear in the United States right now. But I also know, because I look at the numbers and I read this data, that the odds of being kidnapped are actually so rare. They are statistically almost nil. And in fact, if somebody did this math, if you really wanted your child to be kidnapped, which is a weird thing to want, but hypothetically, if you wanted that to happen, you would have to leave your child outside on the street 24 hours a day for 750,000 years to be guaranteed of getting kidnapped. And so that's not actually the fear we want to have about the world. That's not actually what's dangerous in the world, which you can see, the stranger danger thing that I grew up with, right? Don't accept candy from strangers in cars. But what's really dangerous is letting our child be unsupervised on the internet alone in their bedroom. And that doesn't feel scary because it doesn't look scary. But I am here to tell you that when we want to keep our kids safe, what we need to think about is what are the right things to worry about. So remember, you are susceptible to that 24/7 clickbait headlines, and that we tend to overestimate the wrong things. And this is really hard. And I struggle with this as a parent myself too. I want to provide it. I want to be able to reach my kid. I want to be able to see where they are. But do I need that? And here are 3 questions that I invite parents to think about when we make decisions like giving our kid a watch or a phone to find out where they are, to walk home alone. And I want you to keep these in mind from literally birth on. These are the questions we need to be asking ourselves about screen time and parenting and children. If I choose to give a screen-based option, what do I gain? Often we gain convenience, quiet, communication. Sometimes that's not a bad thing. Again, remember, I'm not anti-tech, I'm tech intentional. But we also have to ask, what do I lose or replace in that choice, right? Am I losing an opportunity to teach my child something, or for my child to learn something independent? Or am I replacing a skill that really needs to be taught before we hand over the screen? And then finally, what do we model? If we're modeling that when a child is having a tantrum, a screen is going to be handed to them, what are we modeling for them? That when our emotions are high, that we turn to digital tech to soothe? That is not a lesson we want our children to learn. And so you're in a great position to make some really impactful changes as parents now by thinking about these 3 questions in relationship to how and when we give tech. So the final mindset shift that I want to talk about is this. Oh my gosh, number 1, I got to flip my numbers. See, I'm not perfect. I am a human who is learning. So we want to think about how we can move from a sense of compliance-based parenting to one that's more relationship focused. And this is, again, to build off of this idea of scary versus dangerous. We're looking, remember, at both the present, the way things are right now, and we're looking at the long term. What is it going to take to have that long-term arc, the foundation of what our children need to be happy and healthy as they grow? And it is not going to be through a compliance-based relationship. Here's what I see compliance-based relationships being rooted in, right? Hard and fast rules, punitive response to behavior, over-monitoring, surveilling our children. This would be like, finding where they are on the map and then texting them, why aren't you where you're supposed to be? Compliance is going to be rooted in our own parental anxiety about the world, not necessarily the real risks of the world. Compliance-based parenting is confusing and ineffective, and it is short-term focus. Now, one caveat to this: if our child is running out into the middle of the street, we need to yell, stop, there's a car coming. That makes sense. And that is the exception to this. But when we're focused on demanding compliance, we're thinking short-term. And when it comes to screen time, it is so important that we think longer term. So in a compliance mindset, this is what I see parents doing with digital tech, using a device to soothe, to end boredom, to punish or reward behavior, to quiet a child, to distract them, or to ignore them, or to let them ignore us. And I'm going to go back for a second to that punish and reward, because that is very much a tactic that I used in my past before I knew more. But when we use screen time to punish or reward, when we use it as an incentive for better behavior or choices, and we say, if you don't do X, you lose screen time, or if you want screen time, you have to do this, what we are doing is loading screen time even more. We're giving it even more power. And it is a short-term dopamine seeking fix, right? Kids are like, oh, I want it, so I'm going to do it. The problem is now we set that expectation up. So if it works for that 5-year-old or that 3-year-old, what's going to happen when they're 13 or 15, right? We have to take that long view, and it's hard. But I want you to avoid doing these things, because in the end, those are going to go back to that compliance mindset and not the relationship one. So let's talk about what a relationship mindset will look like. It's going to be us modeling. We'll talk about that in a minute. Mentoring, not monitoring. It is going to be us guided in our decision-making by research, not fear. It is going to be constant conversations with our children. Sometimes we're going to get it right and sometimes we're not. That's normal. That's parenting, right? It's going to be developmentally appropriate. So whatever our children are doing, both in how they access tech, but how we respond to it. And it's tech intentional, living with our values, limiting and delaying access that interferes with healthy development. And it is long-term focused. And so what that looks like is, instead of using a device, we soothe with our words. We allow time for boredom. We reinforce positive behaviors, not using screen time as that external reward. We comfort and we empathize with our child, which is good parenting no matter what, right? And we redirect with non-tech tools whenever possible. And we engage with our child. It's okay to say, I know you really want the iPad right now, or I can see you're really upset. Let's find a way to calm down, and then we can talk about it. It's okay to do that. It is okay to say no. And so this is the list of things, obviously, that I want us to strive for. So at the end of the day, child development is relationship. It is rooted in how our children learn by spending time and interaction with us. And when we think about very young babies, and I am not shaming parents, we get enough parent shaming to go around for a lifetime. But when we are doing things by triangulating our focus with young children and technology, when we're holding a baby, but we have a device in our hand, we are confusing things. We are not focused on that relationship mindset. And what I want to say is, this is about following the rules 80% of the time. There are going to be times where we do hand a phone over, or we do look at our own social media while holding a baby. That's okay. I actually have a solution for that, because the idea isn't to be absolutist in any of this. We are not going to get this 100% right all the time. And so go for the 80-20. As much as you can within your values, we're doing the things that we want to do. So the solutions I have to offer, the first one is going to solve this problem of when you do have those occasions where you're reaching for your phone. And it's called living your life out loud. And what this looks like is, as you're holding your child or playing with your child and your phone makes a noise, you say things like, I'm reaching for my phone. I heard the notification, or I heard the alert. I'm going to look at it and see what it is. Oh, look, it's a text from mom, and she's telling me what time she's coming home from work. And then, oh gosh, I just got another alert. It's literally the play-by-play of technology. I always say to parents of older kids and tweens, you know this is working as a strategy when the kids start rolling their eyes at you, especially those tweens. And that's what we want, because I follow the work of, or I really respect the work of Magda Gerber, Resources for Infant Educators. And one of the things that she does is this idea of living your life out loud really is rooted in some of her work. She talks about narrating what you're doing with a baby when you're doing it. I'm picking you up. I'm putting you down on the changing table. Oh, that air must feel cold. I'm going to reach for the diaper. Is this okay? There are so many wonderful things that are happening, right? We're building executive function. We're modeling consent. We don't really think about this, but when it comes to our phones, we can say to our kids, can I take your picture? Even of our nonverbal babies, we can say, may I take your picture? Pause, let them respond, and then say, okay, I'm going to take your picture. Why does this matter for a 3-month-old? Because when that 3-month-old is 13, they're going to know that someone needs to ask their permission to take a photo. That is hugely valuable. And so again, if we're looking at this long-term trajectory of development and what's going to be important for that healthy development, it starts when they are young. I said for a minute that we do need to talk about parents and screen time because we have our own challenges. We have our own issues with device use. And I just want to highlight, I do surveys all the time of parent communities I speak to. And on average, 85 to 90% of parents admit that they keep a phone in their bedroom at night. Remember, replace judgment with curiosity here. I know it's your alarm clock. And I don't get money from the alarm clock industry to say this, but alarm clocks are a lot less expensive than smartphones, and they're not internet connected usually, and they work. And so the other question I ask is about how do you feel about your own screen time? And parents will often say a third of them, only a third of them feel positively about their own screen use. And another 50% say it's actually really challenging to manage my own screen use. The takeaway from this is that we're in this together. You are not alone. This is hard. For non-parents have trouble managing smartphones and social media too. And so the important thing here is if we have young people watching us, if we have young people in our house or in our lives, they're going to learn how to use digital tech by watching us. And the important thing to remember is, again, not shaming and blaming here, but what can I do? How can I be more intentional about it? When can I put it away? When can I live my life out loud to model what healthy tech looks like? And in fact, Dr. Catherine Steiner Adair, who wrote The Big Disconnect, says everything a baby needs comes from relationships with people and interactions with the environment. When we triangulate our relationship with our babies in tech, we compromise that essential connection. And then Jillian Jarvis, the OT, told me her biggest concerns are around the influence that both children's screen time and parents' screen time are having on children's development. So it's not just what our kids are doing or experiencing. It is also how we as adults are behaving with our screens around our children. So again, the solution to that is living our life out loud. We want our kids to hear that it is hard for us too. We can talk about the emotional challenges of managing screen time as adults. Yes, even with very young children, because that habit begins very young and it lasts. The second thing I want to talk about with solutions is that messy tactile play is absolutely one of the most important things we can do for healthy brain development. And so anytime you can give your kids opportunities to play and get dirty, go for it, because screen-based experiences can be very limiting in those pathways that children are building because screens don't use and engage all of our senses. So of course, playing in the mud is one of the best ways to get that tactile play. And as I said in the beginning, this is my TLDR. Later is better, less is more, relationships first. So final thing, I have a brand new book, fresh off the press, that is not even in the shops yet. And if you would like an opportunity to win a copy of it, I am asking you to sign up for my mailing list. There's a QR code there because yay technology. And I also can put a link in the chat. And if you do that, what I'll do is if you win, I will email you and get your address and mail that to you. So with that, I'm just wondering if there are any questions, because I know we're right at time. Erica, I don't know if there are other questions in the chat or if people want to, how do you do that? What's the best way?
I did pull up the Q&A, and the one question that we have right now is, we ask families about their routines. What do you think if we specifically ask how much time does their child family spend on screens during our assessment and evaluation? Then consider that as a possible outcome on the IFSP if screen time is excessive beyond the AAP recommendation.
Yeah. I think it's, well, again, I'm not a clinician, so I just want to say, like, I can't specify whether that's a diagnostic strategy. My opinion is that always it's good to ask how much kids are getting on screens. And again, the thing to remember on all this is nuance, right? Like sometimes parents will ask me like, well, is it okay if there's like a TV on in the background, right? But the baby's on the floor and can't see it. Well, yeah, I mean, again, one of the things I like to think of is that greater than, less than thing that we learned in elementary school math, you know, the alligator that eats the bigger number. Anytime you can use a bigger screen versus a smaller screen, that's better, right? Or anytime you can have more people around and audio on as opposed to headphones, that's better. So it's sometimes that choices within choices. And yeah, I think it's always beneficial to ask. And the other question to follow up with just the quantity is like, do you notice behavioral changes? Do you notice an impact when your child is spending time on games or social media or watching things on YouTube, whatever it is? So yeah, I think always more information is better. Even in the survey I did of middle schoolers this week, 65% of parents noticed a difference in their children's behavior after social media and gaming. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts? I do see a couple things popping up here. Thank you. Yeah, please let me know if you have questions too. You via email. I also do offer free monthly webinars for parents just to kind of do a quick 20-minute highlight on different concepts. So that's another way to just get information if you're interested in learning more. Oh, thank you. It's nice to hear all of this. Oh, link for email said bad gateway. Oh, well, isn't that lovely? Technology, the other way to do it is just to go to my website, which I'll pop in the chat here. Let's see if that works. And there should be a sign up for the mailing list as well. Let's see. Is that one-on-one? Oh, the webinars listed on my website as well. Yep. Okay, great. Yeah, and if you have trouble getting through, you can just send an email, go through the website. If you're interested in starting a book club, I'm a big fan, former English teacher here, of grab a few other parents to read this. I will say that the book that I wrote, this book is really, really great for the younger parents. It's got stuff in it for parents of older kids, but it was the 0 to 10-year-old parents I was thinking about when I wrote it, because I feel like it's the tool I wish I had when my kids were little. So yeah. Oh, okay. I think I'm looking at the chat, but is there also questions? Sorry, Erica, did I?
No, you're fine. We do have 2 other questions that I see in the Q&A. If that's okay.
Sure. I've heard some people say screen time can be regulatory for children on the spectrum. So again, I'm not a clinician and I can't speak to that. So I would just definitely recommend trusted resources for this one. My opinion about this is that while there are maybe some exceptions, I think that's a big thing. And in part, it's because of that persuasive design algorithm. That's what I worry about, is that maybe there are elements that are a good tool, but because it is designed to be so addictive, I feel like that could introduce a whole different challenge that would be problematic in other ways. But I'm going to defer to the experts on that one, because I don't want to misspeak on that. Coco Melon. So I don't know Coco Melon as well as I know Bluey, because my 12-year-old loves Bluey, which is amazing to me. And I have found it actually pretty delightful myself to watch. The content isn't necessarily so important as the way in which it is being viewed with the child. So if there are things that you're doing with your child using Coco Melon, Bluey, whatever it is, it's the conversations, or I see Miss Rachel in there as well. A little bit's okay, a lot's too much, less is more, right? Again, all of these things that I'm saying, just about kind of keeping it to a minimum, making it the exception, not the rule, engaging with your kids while you're doing it. Another really interesting resource, I can pop this in the chat too. If you look up, I mentioned Dr. Dimitri Christakis, who did a really good TED Talk about pacing, the pace of children's television programming. And what he found is that modern day television and shows move so rapidly that it isn't in sync with child development. If you go, and you can of course look these up on YouTube, look at Mr. Rogers. Remember Mr. Rogers? I grew up at Mr. Rogers. It is painfully slow to watch his episodes, right? Because he's just so calm and slow, right? And it's wonderful because it's very developmentally appropriate. What's happening with digital tech, all of us, right? How many characters can we consume to get our news headlines now? We don't read long form things anymore. We read quick clickbait. So for children too, we don't want to bombard them with so much information and stimuli. And so that TED Talk he does talks a lot about the pacing piece of it as a decision-making guide in screen time, and not so much the content itself, if that makes sense. So yeah, my website is thescreentimeconsultant.com. And I always love hearing from other, parents that, about your experiences as well. Oh, I see another one. Digital autism, children that appear autistic, but with drastic reduction of screen time, that they don't display those anymore. I have heard of that. There's a person I follow, I know on Instagram, Michael McLeod is his name. it's like MCLEOD, and he does Grow Now ADHD. And I feel like I really like his content and what he says. He's very specific towards parents of kids with ADHD. It's not autism, but he talks about how with that certain diagnosis, sometimes that cold turkey, no screen time approach works. It's not one I typically recommend for all children and families, but that is his approach to it as well. Another resource I can recommend is Dr. Victoria Dunkley's book called, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the book name, but Dr. Victoria Dunkley, I can pop her in the chat as well. And she looks at, I think it's called Resetting Your Child's Brain. And she looks a little bit more at the neurodiversities. She might tend to be a little more of the cold turkey approach that I would recommend, but again, she has expertise in that neurodevelopmental piece more than I do. So I would defer to her on some of that as well. So yeah, Erica, anything else there popping up I'm not seeing? I think we're good.
No, it looks like you covered them all.
Okay, well, it's an honor and a privilege to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for being here. And that was a very informative session. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. You're so
And
welcome.
that is it for all of our sessions today. I wanted to thank everyone for joining our 2023 EI Forum. I hope you found today's sessions beneficial to your work. I would just like to reiterate that if you registered for CPDUs, you should receive an email that will prompt you to go to Member Connect to retrieve those. Also, the materials from today's sessions will be in Member Connect, as well as the Padlet that I've shared the link in each chat today. If you have any questions after today's forum, please feel free to reach out to me via email or phone. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.